The call came through at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday while I was in the control room at Northeast Grid Operations, staring at 15 monitoring systems flashing red warnings. Power grid attack, 3 substations compromised, rolling blackouts affecting 400,000 households. My phone buzzed. I almost ignored it because when you're managing a cyber attack that's taking down electrical infrastructure, corporate calls feel irrelevant compared to SCADA alerts telling you someone's trying to crash the power grid. But I answered anyway, because that's what 23 years of being the crisis guy conditions you to do. Pierce speaking. Grayson, it's Mason Clark from headquarters. Effective immediately, we no longer require your services as Senior Infrastructure Security Specialist. Your employment is terminated as of today. I looked at the console, Substation Alpha showing critical system breach, Substation Bravo reporting unauthorized access attempts every 30 seconds. Nicole Torres, the plant operations director, standing 10 feet away looking at me like I was the only thing between her facility and complete grid collapse. Which I was. I understand. I'll inform Nicole that headquarters will be handling the breach response for the infrastructure attack I'm currently managing. Long silence. What attack? The coordinated cyber attack on our power distribution network that brought me here 18 hours ago. 3 substations are compromised. We're looking at $60,000 per hour in emergency costs, plus federal compliance violations. I'm tracing the intrusion through 25-year-old SCADA protocols. Grayson, let's discuss this after you've resolved the grid situation. I don't think that's appropriate. You just terminated my employment. I shouldn't be working on company projects if I'm no longer an employee. He hung up. My name is Grayson Pierce. I'm just 48 years old, and I just got fired while managing a cybersecurity crisis that nobody else at my company knows how to solve. I joined Industrial Systems Corp in 2001 when I was 25, right out of technical college with a degree in industrial automation. Back then, I believed in the old way of doing business, the way my grandfather taught me when he worked 40 years at the steel mill in Pittsburgh. You showed up every day, you did your job right, you looked out for your fellow workers, and the company looked out for you. That was the deal. That was how it was supposed to work. I specialized in legacy infrastructure, the systems that kept the lights on, water flowing, gas pumping, SCADA networks, programmable logic controllers, distributed control systems. This wasn't the sexy tech stuff you read about in magazines. This was the backbone of American industry, built by guys who knew how to make things that lasted. When a power company got hacked and their IT department couldn't trace the intrusion, they called Industrial Systems. Industrial Systems sent me. I was the guy who understood both the old-school craftsmanship that built these systems and the new-school threats trying to tear them down. Over 23 years, I'd responded to 310 security emergencies across 15 states. I'd traced attacks on water treatment plants, diagnosed breaches in natural gas distribution networks, and stopped hackers from shutting down electrical grids that powered entire cities. I'd worked through hurricanes when linemen were out restoring power lines and engineers like me were inside making sure the systems they connected to were secure. I'd missed family dinners, weekend fishing trips with my son Brady, anniversary celebrations with my wife Diana. I'd spent my 45th birthday in a server room in Cleveland, while Diana celebrated alone at home with a store-bought cake. That's what dedication looked like in my generation. When your community needed you, you showed up. The work wasn't just a job, it was a calling. These weren't just computer networks I was protecting. Every time I secured a power grid, I was making sure hospitals could keep running during emergencies. Every water treatment plant I protected meant families could turn on their taps and trust what came out. Every gas distribution system I secured meant people could heat their homes when winter hit hard. Most importantly, over those 23 years, I developed deep expertise in legacy SCADA protocols that most of the utility industry still runs on, but nobody teaches in school anymore. Every power company had unique implementations. Every system had custom modifications built by engineers who'd retired decades ago. Every security model had quirks that existed only in my experience-based understanding of how American infrastructure really worked. That knowledge was what made me valuable. That knowledge was also what Mason Clark had just eliminated from Industrial Systems' crisis response capability at the worst possible moment. The grid attack had started 19 hours earlier. 3 utilities minus Northeast Grid Operations, Connecticut Valley Electric, and Regional Power Cooperative had called our emergency hotline within 2 hours of each other, reporting sophisticated intrusion attempts. All 3 used similar legacy SCADA architectures. All three were experiencing identical attack patterns. This wasn't some script kiddie trying to cause chaos for internet fame. This was the kind of coordinated attack that defense contractors and federal agencies had been warning us about for years. Someone with serious resources and deep technical knowledge was systematically probing the backbone of the Northeast's electrical infrastructure. Our standard protocol was remote diagnostics first. I'd spent 6 hours on secure video calls with each utility's security teams, walking them through trace procedures and reviewing intrusion logs. By midnight Monday, I knew this wasn't something that could be resolved from our office in Jersey. The attack pattern suggested someone with insider knowledge of American infrastructure was probing for vulnerabilities in 20-year-old code that most people assumed was too obsolete to be worth attacking. They were wrong. Old code isn't automatically secure code, it's just code that nobody remembers how to fix when it breaks. And the guys who built it, the real craftsmen who understood every circuit and every subroutine, most of them had retired or died. Companies like Industrial Systems had spent decades laying off the experienced engineers and replacing them with younger, cheaper workers who knew the latest programming languages, but had never worked with systems that were built to run for 30 years without replacement. I arrived at Northeast Grid at 7 a.m. Tuesday. Nicole Torres met me at the security checkpoint. She looked like she hadn't slept in 3 days, which she probably hadn't. Mr. Pierce, thank God you're here. We've been in emergency protocols for 20 hours. The State Regulatory Commission is asking why we can't secure our own systems. Because this attack pattern is targeting vulnerabilities that require hands-on experience with industrial control systems. These hackers understand our infrastructure better than most of the people we've hired to protect it. She led me to the secure control room. 2 floors of humming industrial computers, each one managing thousands of electrical distribution points across the region. When they were working normally, they processed power distribution for 2.3 million customers, all running on backup protocols now, all costing Northeast Grid approximately $25,000 per hour in emergency operations. This was the kind of place that reminded me why I got into this business. These weren't just computers. They were the industrial heart of America, built by engineers who understood that when you're managing electricity for millions of people, you don't get to have beta software or move fast and break things. You build it right the first time and you make it last. By 10 p.m. Tuesday, after 15 hours of tracing attack vectors through 3 different utility networks, I'd isolated the vulnerability. The hackers were exploiting a buffer overflow in legacy SCADA code that handled load distribution calculations. The vulnerability existed in custom control software that Industrial Systems had helped implement in 2003. I was part of the original development team. I was one of only 3 people who understood how that distribution code worked, and the other 2 had retired years ago. It's funny how technology works. We built these systems to last forever, and they did, but forever in engineering terms means dealing with problems nobody anticipated 20 years later. The code we wrote in 2003 was rock solid for its time. We never imagined that hackers in 2024 would have the computing power and patience to probe for buffer overflows in SCADA subroutines that controlled maybe 50,000 customers back then, but now managed over 2 million. This was exactly the kind of institutional knowledge that companies like Industrial Systems had been systematically eliminating for years. They'd rather hire 3 recent college graduates for the price of 1 experienced engineer, not understanding that some expertise can't be learned from textbooks or online tutorials. You had to live through the implementation, understand the compromises that were made, remember the assumptions that seemed reasonable 2 decades ago but had become vulnerabilities today. My grandfather used to tell me stories about the steel mill where he worked for 40 years. The young guys come in thinking they know everything, he'd say. But there's things you only learn by doing the job for 20 years. You learn how the machines sound when something's about to break. You learn which shortcuts are safe and which ones will get somebody killed. That's not something you can Google. Fixing this vulnerability required patching 21-year-old SCADA modules and implementing new input validation routines without disrupting existing power distribution operations. This wasn't like updating your smartphone. You couldn't just download a patch and restart. Every change had to be tested, validated, and implemented with surgical precision. One mistake, and you could black out the entire Northeast corridor for days. I estimated 14 to 18 hours of careful programming work across all 3 utilities. It was the kind of work that required not just technical knowledge, but institutional memory. You had to understand not just how the code worked, but why it was written that way. what assumptions the original programmers made, and how those assumptions had changed over 2 decades of system upgrades and load increases. I started at 10:30 p.m. Tuesday night. By 11:47 p.m., I was halfway through updating the first set of SCADA modules when Mason called and told me I was fired. After Mason hung up, Nicole approached me cautiously. You could see the panic starting to set in as she processed what she'd just overheard. "Mr. Pierce, is everything all right? I just got terminated while securing your power grid." Her face went white. In her world, utilities didn't just shut down for maintenance. Every hour these systems stayed compromised was costing her company money and reputation it couldn't afford to lose. "But you're the only person who understands our legacy protocols. What happens to our systems? Industrial systems will need to send someone else. How long will that take?" The other engineer who understands these SCADA protocols is Shane Murphy. He's in Denver on a federal contract for another 12 days, plus travel time. Nicole was doing the math in her head. We were talking about extended grid vulnerability affecting 2.3 million customers, emergency power costs approaching $1.44 million per day, and federal compliance penalties that could reach 8 figures. We can't wait 12 days. Every day these vulnerabilities exist puts the entire regional grid at risk. Then I suggest you contact Industrial Systems Corporate and explain the urgency. At 1:15 a.m., my phone rang again. Hunter Webb, Industrial Systems Chief Operating Officer. Hunter had been with the company for 16 years and understood exactly how critical my role was to infrastructure crisis management. He was also smart enough to realize that Mason had just made a catastrophic error in judgment. "Grayson, there's been a misunderstanding about your employment status. We need you to complete the grid emergency before we discuss any personnel matters." Hunter, Mason was very clear. He said my employment was terminated effective immediately. That's not a misunderstanding, that's termination. I could hear the desperation creeping into his voice. Hunter understood the implications in a way that Mason obviously didn't. This wasn't just about one disgruntled employee. This was about Industrial Systems' entire reputation in the utility industry. "I understand this is confusing, but let's focus on resolving the grid crisis first. We can address your employment situation after you've secured the systems. I don't think that's appropriate. If I'm terminated, I shouldn't be working on company projects. If I'm not terminated, then Mason needs to call me back and clarify that he made an error. This is a critical infrastructure situation. These utilities are losing hundreds of thousands per day. We need you to complete the security patches. Then you need to clarify my employment status first. Am I an Industrial Systems employee or not?" Long pause. I could hear Hunter thinking through the implications. If he said I was still employed, he'd be contradicting Mason's termination and creating internal political problems. If he said I was terminated, he'd be admitting that Industrial Systems had just eliminated their crisis response capability in the middle of their most expensive emergency. "Grayson, let me conference in Mason so we can resolve this together." "I'd rather you didn't." Mason was clear about his decision. "I'm respecting that decision by no longer working on Industrial Systems projects. If the utilities need assistance, they should contact your emergency response line and request another engineer. There is no other engineer available who understands these legacy SCADA systems. That's an unfortunate situation, but it's not my problem anymore since I'm no longer an Industrial Systems employee." I ended the call. Nicole was standing nearby, having heard my side of the conversation. The weight of the situation was settling on her shoulders like a lead blanket. At my age, I'd seen this look before, the moment when someone in management realizes they're completely dependent on something they don't understand and can't control. "What should we do, Mr. Pierce?" "You should contact Industrial Systems and request emergency engineering support. Explain the urgency of the situation. They'll prioritize getting someone here as quickly as possible, but you're here now. You understand our systems. You were in the middle of fixing the vulnerability. Can't you just complete the work?" I thought about that carefully. In the old days, my grandfather's days, you'd finish the job regardless of company politics because it was the right thing to do. When the community needed you, personal grievances took a backseat to public service. That was the code skilled tradesmen lived by. But I'd learned something important over 23 years in corporate America. Loyalty has to go both ways. I'd given Industrial Systems my best years, missed family dinners, worked holidays, and built their reputation one crisis at a time. I'd been there for every emergency, every late-night call, every weekend, when systems failed and needed an expert who could think on his feet. The moment it became convenient, they threw me away like a broken piece of equipment. I was fired 2 hours ago. I can't ethically continue working on a project for a company that just terminated my employment. What if we hired you directly? Not through Industrial Systems, but as an independent consultant working for Northeast Grid Operations. Now that was interesting. I'd never considered going independent, but at 48, maybe it was time to think about options beyond the corporate ladder. My wife Diana had been telling me for years that I was too valuable to let one company control my future. She'd grown up watching her father work 35 years for a chemical plant, believing his expertise and loyalty would guarantee security. When the company got bought out by a foreign corporation, they eliminated his pension and laid him off at 62. Nobody looks out for you except you, she'd always said. These companies will use you up and throw you away the minute some accountant decides you're too expensive. That would create contractual complications, I told Nicole. Your utility has service agreements with Industrial Systems. Those agreements probably have exclusivity provisions preventing you from hiring outside consultants to work on Industrial Systems design systems. I'll check our contracts. She called Northeast Grid's legal department, had a quick conversation that involved a lot of technical terms and urgent whispers, then looked at me with cautious optimism. Our legal team says the service agreement has exclusivity provisions for routine maintenance, but emergency patches can be conducted by any qualified consultant if Industrial Systems cannot provide timely support. They're defining timely support as within 48 hours of request. That was the opening I needed. Not just to solve this immediate crisis, but to test whether there was a future beyond Industrial Systems. At 48, I was too old to start over at another company, but maybe not too old to start working for myself. Have the utilities formally requested emergency support from Industrial Systems. She sent an email to Industrial Systems Emergency Response Team, copying me, formally requesting immediate engineering support for the grid security breach and noting that the previous engineer, me, was no longer available to complete the patchwork. She marked it urgent and requested response within 6 hours. At 3:30 a.m., we received a response from Industrial Systems Emergency Coordinator that told us everything we needed to know about how this was going to play out. We acknowledge your request for emergency engineering support. Our senior infrastructure specialists are currently committed to other client emergencies. We are working to identify available resources and will provide an estimated response timeline within 18 hours. 18 hours. In corporate speak, that meant they had no idea how to solve this problem without me, but they weren't ready to admit it yet. Hunter was probably spending his Wednesday morning calling every contractor and consultant he could find, trying to locate someone who understood SCADA protocols well enough to not make the crisis worse. Nicole showed me the email with the kind of desperate expression you see on people who are watching their career go down in flames through no fault of their own. What does this mean? It means Industrial Systems doesn't have anyone available to send. Shane is in Denver, and apparently nobody else at the company has the expertise to handle SCADA vulnerabilities. So we wait unless you want to exercise your contract provision and hire an independent consultant. Are you available as an independent consultant? This was the moment. At 48, after 23 years of corporate life, I was being offered the chance to work for myself, to set my own rates, choose my own projects, and never again have to worry about some middle manager deciding my expertise was too expensive. Deanna had been right. This wasn't a crisis, it was an opportunity. I could be. What would your rate structure look like? I thought about that carefully. Independent consulting rates for emergency infrastructure work typically range from $250 to $800 per hour depending on expertise level and urgency. I was at the top of the expertise scale, and this was definitely urgent. But more than that, I was the only person available who could solve this problem. That kind of scarcity has value. $450 per hour for emergency security work, minimum 24-hour engagement to ensure complete vulnerability patching and system validation. That's $10,800 total payment terms. 50% deposit before I resume work, remaining 50% upon successful system restoration. Nicole didn't even blink. When your power grid is vulnerable to cyber attack and you're facing federal penalties that could reach tens of millions, $10,800 for a solution starts looking like a bargain. Done. I'll have our CFO process the deposit immediately. At 4:45 a.m. Wednesday morning, my phone chimed with a bank transfer notification. $5,400 had just cleared into my personal checking account. More money than I'd ever received for a single day's work in my entire career. At 5 a.m., I resumed work on the SCADA security patches, but now I was working for myself. The funny thing about doing the same work as an independent consultant instead of a corporate employee is how different it feels. Every line of code I wrote was billable. Every problem I solved was building my reputation instead of someone else's company. Every decision was mine to make. For the first time in 23 years, I wasn't just fixing someone else's crisis, I was building my own future. By 2 p.m. Wednesday, I'd completed the vulnerability fixes across all 3 utility systems. The work went faster than expected because I wasn't dealing with corporate approval processes or having to document every decision for managers who wouldn't understand the technical details anyway. By 6 p.m., I'd updated the security protocols and conducted full system testing. By 10 p.m., all 3 utilities were back to normal operations with no security vulnerabilities and no power distribution errors. Total crisis time, 47 hours. Total emergency costs, approximately $2.82 million. But the systems were secure, and the patches I'd implemented would prevent similar SCADA-based attacks in the future. More importantly, I'd just proven to myself that I didn't need industrial systems. They needed me. Nicole was watching the distribution monitors with visible relief as power management returned to normal operations across the grid. The green lights were beautiful, each one representing thousands of customers who had their electricity back, finally flowing through the system like it was supposed to. Mr. Pierce, I cannot thank you enough. You saved us from a disaster that would have been catastrophically worse if we'd waited for industrial systems to send another engineer. You're welcome. I'll prepare a technical report documenting the vulnerability, attack methodology, and patch procedures. You should share that with industrial systems so they can update their security documentation. At 11 p.m. Wednesday night, I received a call from Hunter Webb. I was back at my apartment in Jersey, exhausted, but satisfied with the past 2 days' work. More than satisfied, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Pride in work that was entirely mine. Grayson, I understand you completed the grid security work as an independent consultant. We need to discuss your employment status. Mason's decision to terminate you was premature. We'd like to offer you reinstatement with full back pay and benefits. I appreciate that, but I'm declining. I'm now operating as an independent consultant. It's more lucrative, and I have better control over which projects I accept. What does that mean for industrial systems? You're our most experienced infrastructure expert. It means industrial systems will need to develop other engineers with similar expertise or accept that your crisis response capability is significantly reduced. The truth was, at 48, I'd finally learned what my father never had the chance to. He'd worked 28 years for the same utility company, believing that loyalty and hard work would guarantee security. When the company got bought out, they eliminated his pension and laid him off at 56. He spent his last 9 working years bouncing between temporary jobs, never again finding the security he'd thought he'd earned. I wasn't going to make his mistake. That's not acceptable. We have ongoing client emergencies that require your specific knowledge. Then industrial systems should have considered that before terminating me while I was literally in the middle of managing one of those emergencies. Grayson, I understand you're upset about how Mason handled the situation. I'm not upset, Hunter. I'm simply making rational business decisions based on new information. Mason demonstrated that industrial systems doesn't value my contributions enough to avoid terminating me during a crisis. I've learned from that demonstration. When I told Diana what had happened, she just smiled and opened a bottle of wine we'd been saving for a special occasion. Finally, she said, I was wondering how long it would take you to figure out what I've been telling you for 20 years. Which is what? That you were too good for them. That you were making other people rich off your expertise while worrying about whether they'd keep you around. Now you get to make yourself rich. She was right, as usual. Deanna had been watching me stress about corporate politics and budget cuts for years, wondering when I'd realize that my value didn't depend on some manager's opinion of whether I was worth my salary. She'd grown up in a union household where her father had been a shop steward at the chemical plant. He'd taught her that skilled workers had power when they stuck together and knew their worth. You know what the best part is? She said, pouring herself a glass of wine. Brady's going to be so proud when he finds out his old man finally stood up for himself. Brady was in his 2nd year at Penn State, studying mechanical engineering. He'd grown up hearing my work stories, the late-night emergency calls, the weekends spent troubleshooting systems while other dads were at their kids' soccer games. He'd always been proud of what I did, but I could tell he worried about the way the company treated me. When I called him the next day to tell him what had happened, his reaction surprised me. Dad, that's awesome. I've been waiting for you to tell those corporate guys where to stick it. Language, son, sorry. But seriously, you've been talking for years about how they don't appreciate what you do. Now you can work with people who actually value your expertise. Over the next 6 weeks, I received 18 emergency calls from utilities and infrastructure companies experiencing security crises. Each call followed the same pattern. Sophisticated attack on legacy systems. Industrial systems couldn't respond quickly enough. Could I help as an independent consultant? I helped 16 of them. Total consulting revenue $109,000 for 6 weeks of work. That was more than I'd made in the previous 2 years at Industrial Systems. Word spreads fast in the infrastructure security industry, especially among the old-timers who remembered when companies were run by engineers instead of MBAs. By September, I was receiving calls from utilities that had never worked with Industrial Systems, asking if I was available for security audits and ongoing vulnerability consulting. These weren't emergency calls. They were companies that wanted to prevent emergencies by having someone who understood their legacy systems before problems occurred. The work was different as an independent consultant. Instead of being seen as an expense that needed to be managed, I was seen as an expert whose advice was worth paying for. Plant managers would walk me through their facilities, explaining their concerns, and asking for my recommendations. They treated my time as valuable because they were paying for it directly. By November, I had 8 long-term consulting contracts with infrastructure companies who wanted guaranteed access to my SCADA expertise when they needed it. Combined retainer revenue, $18,000 monthly, approximately $216,000 annually, plus additional project fees that were pushing my total income toward $385,000. In December, Industrial Systems formally offered me a consulting arrangement. $450 per hour for active security work. $3,000 monthly retainer for availability and consultation. 6-month contract renewable at my discretion. I accepted, because it was guaranteed revenue and Industrial Systems represented one of the most reliable sources of emergency work. Plus, there was something deeply satisfying about them paying me more in 6 months than they'd paid me in 3 years as an employee. Mason Clark lasted until February. The board terminated him after they calculated that his decision to fire me during the grid crisis had cost Industrial Systems approximately $1 in lost client contracts, emergency recovery costs, and consulting fees they were now paying me instead of employing me directly. The irony wasn't lost on me. They were now paying me more in 8 months than they'd paid me in 4 years as an employee. I stayed independent. By late 2024, I was managing 9 long-term consulting relationships with infrastructure companies across the Northeast. Annual revenue was approaching $385,000. I was working approximately 60% of the hours I'd worked at Industrial Systems while earning nearly triple my previous salary. More importantly, I was valued. When clients called me for security crises, they understood they were paying premium rates for premium expertise. Nobody questioned whether my approach was worth the investment. They'd all seen what happened when they tried to solve legacy system vulnerabilities without specialized knowledge. But the real change wasn't financial. It was psychological. For the first time in my career, I wasn't worried about layoffs, corporate restructuring, or some new manager deciding I was too expensive. My security came from my expertise, not from someone else's decision about whether to keep me around. Diana and I started talking about things we'd never been able to plan before. Maybe retiring to that cabin in New Hampshire we'd always dreamed about. Maybe taking that trip to Ireland we'd been putting off for 15 years. Maybe helping Brady with a down payment on his first house instead of worrying about whether we'd have enough saved for our own retirement. On a Saturday morning in March, almost a year after Mason's phone call, I was sitting on my back porch with Diana, drinking coffee and reading the newspaper. Brady had driven down from school for the weekend, and he was inside making pancakes, a tradition from when he was little. You know what I realized? Diana said, looking out at our garden where the daffodils were just starting to come up. What's that? You're happy now. Really happy. Not just content or getting by, but actually happy. She was right for the first time in years. I woke up looking forward to my workday. I was solving interesting problems for people who appreciated what I brought to the table. I was building something for my family instead of just surviving paycheck to paycheck. I'm happy, I said. I'm 48 years old, and I finally figured out what I'm worth. Brady came out with a plate of pancakes and sat down with us. Dad, I've been thinking about what happened with your old company. Yeah, I'm glad it happened. Not because losing your job was fun, but because now I get to see what you're like when you're working for yourself instead of working for people who didn't appreciate you. Here's what I learned from the entire experience, and what I wish I'd understood 20 years earlier. The most dangerous employee to fire isn't the one who complains about salary or threatens to quit. It's the one who's literally in the middle of solving a crisis that nobody else knows how to solve when you decide they're expendable. Because when you fire that person, you don't just lose their future contributions, you lose their ability to prevent the immediate disaster that's happening right now. And you discover that replacing specialized expertise during an emergency is impossible. Mason wanted to reduce headcount and eliminate what he saw as an expensive senior engineer. He got exactly what he wanted. I was eliminated, but my expertise wasn't eliminated. It just got a lot more expensive. In my generation, we were taught that companies would take care of us if we were loyal and worked hard. That might have been true once, but it's not true anymore. These days, you have to take care of yourself. The security you build through your own skills and reputation is the only security that nobody can take away from you. The best part? I'm not angry anymore. How can you be angry when someone's mistake turns out to be the best thing that ever happened to your career? Sometimes the best revenge isn't proving people wrong. It's letting them experience the full cost of being right about what they wanted. Mason wanted me gone. I was gone. Then he got to explain to his executives why the company's most critical client crisis was costing an additional $60,000 per hour, because the engineer who could fix it was no longer employed. I didn't sabotage industrial systems. I didn't cause the grid crisis. I didn't prevent other engineers from solving the problem. I simply wasn't there anymore to solve problems that only I knew how to solve because I was no longer required. That turned out to be the most expensive termination decision Mason Clark ever made, and the most lucrative career transition I ever experienced. At 48, I finally learned what my father never had the chance to figure out. Your value isn't determined by what one company is willing to pay you. It's determined by what the market will pay for what you know how to do. And sometimes the market values that knowledge a lot more than your employer ever did. Sometimes the biggest favor your boss can do for you is showing you exactly how little they value what you bring to the table.